CNA is Singapore's national broadcaster, and I found this documentary produced by them to be absolutely fascinating. There's so much to be said about it that I will get into it right now. The documentary focuses on three nations: India, Thailand, with some mention of Vietnam, and Indonesia. From the graph, it should be clear why. India is by far the world's largest exporter of rice. Thailand and Vietnam are second and third, respectively. Each are facing challenges to their crop yields. Indonesia is used to discuss the concerns of importing nations. While mostly self-sufficient in rice, it imports as needed. But because of its recent history, it is also acutely aware of the political instability food scarcity generates. CNA's program covers the environmental and economic realities of rice production facing Southeast Asia, as well as measures they are considering to tackle these challenges. But I am also going to expand beyond CNA's content to include Bangladesh and China. I include China because it is both the world's largest producer and importer of rice, but also because this immense nation is facing an epic water crisis and food production challenges of its own. The crisis casts a very long shadow on the circumstances of rice exporting nations like Thailand and Vietnam, which China might even rely on. I add Bangladesh because it presents a unique window on rural human adaptation in the face of climate change. Because of population growth, Indonesia is acutely aware of its own need to increase production and its own exposure to the international supply chain, issues the other exporting nations also face.
Rice is so important that it is integral to political stability. In Indonesia, the price of rice tripled at the height of the Asian financial crisis in 1998. Food riots ensued. The economic and political upheaval eventually brought down President Suharto.
Begitu negara tidak memiliki ketahanan pangan, otomatis dampaknya apa? Yang pertama, harga bisa naik. Begitu harga bisa naik, kemampuan masyarakat membeli juga menjadi kurang. Nah, disinilah akan menjadi gonjang-ganjing. Oleh karena itu, sekali lagi, ketahanan pangan menjadi fundamental yang utama. Menjadi sangat-sangat penting untuk menjaga tadi, mengeliminir segala macam persoalan-persoalan sosial ke depannya.
In light of fertilizer inflation from the war in Ukraine and problems with rice supply, they are facing off to the risks import dependence has exposed them to. Food scarcity is no longer written into the Western psyche. The privations of the Dust Bowl and the ruin of World War II, which are the last instances of major privation within, say, the US or Europe, have been long forgotten in the afterglow of the agricultural revolution and decades of prosperity after the end of World War II. These are problems of the past. The topic of food insecurity in the West is relegated to poverty, and food scarcity is relegated to the plights of other nations, at least if you're not living in Alaska. Now, those of us in the West might wonder why we should pay attention to what's going on in Asia, but I will remind people that this is half the world's population. They are a consumer base many nations export to, as well as the world's manufacturing center. So if they're worried about filling their bellies, they're not going to be too much worried about exporting. Millions of farmers across Asia are subsistence farmers. They raise food to feed themselves. It is the excess that is sold to market. That goes to the next town, to the next city. It feeds the nation. And the excess beyond that goes on the world market. And with that cash, they can buy the seeds, the fertilizer, and fuel to pump the water that allows them to enjoy a higher crop yield. If the crop yields fail for any reason, they may be reduced to simply feeding themselves best, and they won't have any money for the fancy inputs that allow them the higher yields. Without those fancy inputs, they'll be returned to pre-agricultural revolution farming and to pre-agricultural revolution yields. And if they don't have those higher yields, the rest of the population will also suffer from less food. You see where this is going?
Last year's poor weather halved Vinod's harvest. He's worried about the next planting cycle.
तो वही कटौती चलती है, जैसे अब शिक्षा है, पढ़ाई है, लड़कों बच्चों की है, अब वो तो उसमें तो कटौती नहीं हो सकती है। अब गैस में कटौती हम लोग करते हैं, थोड़ा कम यूज करते हैं, या अन्य खर्चों में कपड़ों में व्यवस्था जैसे है उसको भी कम यूज करते हैं, बनाते हैं, नए कम बनवाते हैं। तो ये जो कटौती करने वाली चीज़ें उनमें कटौती किए जाती है, और तो जो नहीं कटौती हो पाती उसके लिए क्या किया जाएगा।
So, supply shocks in India will reverberate around the world. With output falling in 2022, the government issued a temporary rice export ban in September, prompting an immediate jump in Asian rice prices.
People are becoming more protectionist. They will give much higher priority to their own national food security than allow trade, and international trade has declined, and that's the big issue.
India banned rice exports in the face of the droughts of 2022. This generated clucking by economists who complained that the farmer would see lower prices. Moreover, export bans are not just bad for other poor countries, they're bad for India's own farmers, who are missing out on high prices overseas. While officials from New Delhi have often torpedoed consensus at global summits in the name of defending India's millions of marginal farmers, their actions when it comes to agricultural trade policy show that they're more concerned about urban food prices, not farm profits. I would enjoy seeing economists sitting down to a meal of fried dollar bills and in a sauce béarnaise of pennies. Economists really don't have any attachment to reality. They really think that if farmers can sell their cash crop and somehow subsist off dollars when there's no food to be had in the country, much less all the other people in the country who now don't have access to food either because there isn't enough food, really exhibit a stunning detachment from reality. That's the only way to describe it. It's absurd. In Asia, food scarcity and famine are still within living memory, and in the face of rising demand, development-driven environmental depletion, and climate change, it is an acutely important issue. Do not forget that 1/2 of the world builds our washing machines, our iPhones, our computers. They make our shoes, and they sew our clothing. And before aught else happens in an economy, people must eat.
But the father of 4 children is racing against time to meet the harvest at the end of March.
Soalnya pupuk telat gini, jadi sebetulnya mah udah 15 hari udah dipupuk. Cuman pupuk susah. Sampai umur 1 bulan ini. Sebetulnya kurang anak ini padi. Oh, jadi apa ya, susah pisan nunggu pupuk. Kan lagi krisis ini. Krisis siapa? Ya kekurangan pupuk lah. Telatnya mah kurang pupuk.
Originally from Indramayu in central Java, Charpan has been growing rice in Karawang for 26 years. His 3 harvests usually yield about 15 tons of unhusked rice a year. Each harvest can earn him around 17.5 million rupiah or around $1,100. but about half of that will be used to cover expenses, such as buying seeds and fertilizers, renting a tractor, and buying petrol for his water pump to irrigate the field. This year's first harvest might see a 10% drop in yield due to the fertilizer shortage.
Jadi gimananya? Dari pertama ini kekurangan pupuk nggak ada. Ya termasuk telat pupuk. Baru tahun-tahun sekarang. Biasanya emang enggak.
The reason why Charpan is unable to buy fertilizer lies almost 10,000 kilometers away. The war in Ukraine has created a global fertilizer crisis.
Fertilizer has been one of the main agriculture concerns everywhere, so not just in Indonesia. So with the ongoing global uncertainty, so there's a war in Ukraine, and as a result, restrictions on fertilizer trade, high energy prices, and then the Chinese export quota and export ban on phosphate. As a result, supplies have been tight, and fertilizer prices have seen a record high in April 2022.
On the ground, farmers like Charpan must continue planting with or without subsidized fertilizers.
Ya sebetulnya mah ya enggak lah. Kalau nanam mah kudu penuh. Tapi kan pendapatan beda ntar. Kalau pupuknya kurang mah beda pendapatan.
Tanam kan harus tetap jalan. Kalau tidak ditanam kan menjadi persoalan buat sawah-sawah yang lain kan gitu kan. Ya, artinya tetap itu diupayakan tanam dengan berbagai cara. Mungkin saja dia akan menggunakan pupuk yang tidak subsidi. Mungkin saja itu bisa terjadi di lapangan.
More than half of Thailand's 13 million farmers grow rice. It is the country's most important crop, the main staple, and the biggest agricultural export.
คือจริงๆไม่ว่าอาหารอะไรก็แล้วแต่นะคะการบริโภคในประเทศเนี่ยเป็นสิ่งที่สำคัญในการส่งออกก็หมายความว่าประเทศไทยต้องบริโภคพอเพียงแล้วนะคะแล้วก็ส่งออกแต่ถ้าเกิดว่าภาวะทุกอย่างในโลกนี้ถ้ามันเกิดภาวะในโลกร้อนทั่วไปเหมือนกันทั่วโลกก็คิดว่าคงจะไม่ให้ลดแค่ประเทศไทย
Thailand produces more rice than it consumes, with a portion of the surplus exported or added to the nation's stockpile. But consumption is climbing. Between 2019 and 2023, Thailand's domestic rice consumption has gone up more than 10% to 13 million tons. But output is forecast to rise less than 1% to around 20 million tons in 2023. To keep export numbers stable and to meet domestic demand, Thailand is drawing on its rice stockpile. Inventory at the end of 2022 fell by 1 million tons compared to 2021.
A significant proportion of our Thai farmers rely on rice that they produce for their family use. So with that, can you imagine I'm not having sufficient food for my family and then be able to sell the excess produce for income generation. So, cascade down to insufficient income, insufficient nutrient for the smallholder farmers and its family. And then what about the nation in terms of its importance as a key exporter, a national income generation?
Beyond India's struggles with yield, Thailand and Vietnam struggle with saltwater incursion.
More and more countries are affected by salinity in soil. Vietnam itself, over the last couple of years, have lost about 500,000 hectares due to salinity in lower delta MeKong. And moving forward in the next couple of years, they are targeted to lose almost 2 million hectares of soil due to salinity. And because of Thailand's land position, we're going to see more and more agriculture land being eroded due to salinity.
Climate change has made rice yields more unpredictable. Rising sea levels have salted rice paddies across Asia.
Of the cases you see the food crisis, the crop failure, or things like that, were caused by climate change. That's why to address climate change is the fundamental way to deal with the food security or food insecurity problems. But of course, there are some other issues, military conflicts or bad management, right?
CNA lays this at the foot of sea rise, but they don't directly address the elephant in the room, China's damming of the upper Mekong.
The Yangtze in yellow, the Mekong flows to the south through the territory of China initially, but eventually winds its way through Southeast Asia across multiple other countries like Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and finally on through the river's delta region in southern Vietnam, where it finally empties into the South China Sea. The key facts that make this 4,500-kilometer-long river one of the most important in the world is that it is the primary source of freshwater for nearly 70 million people across Southeast Asia, while simultaneously providing almost 20% of the entire world's freshwater fish supply, which understandably makes the river critical for the life of the entire region, the same way that the Yangtze and Yellow rivers are critical for China's civilization. But despite that massive importance, the Mekong River is currently dying for the nations of Southeast Asia, and a lot of it can be blamed on the policies of China.
Damming the Mekong has killed off the river's freshwater fish, ending that protein supply, the restoration of seasonal flooding brought, and is destroying crops and cropland located near Asian coasts through salinification.
That are further downstream. The existing dams in the lower Mekong Basin today generate about 12,285 megawatts of total power on average, which is a lot, but those 11 Chinese dams on the Lancang in the upper basin, where the water flow is faster, generates theoretically clean. The big problem is that these dams are coming at an ever-increasing environmental cost, made even worse by the fact that the area around the Mekong River is currently suffering from historically low water levels and drought. Just a couple years ago, Cambodia, one of the countries that's the furthest downstream, had to completely shut down their largest dams due to a crippling lack of water flow, which caused the country to endure months of debilitating electricity blackouts and caused major disruptions across the Cambodian economy. Additionally, due to the lower water levels and pressure coming from upstream, salt water from the South China Sea has been able to intrude into the Mekong River Delta in southern Vietnam, devastating Vietnamese farmland and causing fishing stocks in the southern region from there to Cambodia to be depleted by as much as 90%. And of course, the natural rhythm of the river that has been in place for thousands of years has now been almost completely interrupted. As the dams were constructed along the river's main path in the north within China, enormous amounts of water began to be held back, which means that during the wet season, when the communities further downstream were expecting peak water heights, they came up dramatically short, often as much as 5 meters less of water than what could previously have been regularly counted upon. And at no point was this ever more evident than just 3 years ago back in 2019, when the Mekong River reached some of its lowest levels ever seen on record. Sometimes, with little warning, the Chinese dams will suddenly just release staggering volumes of water down through their dams on the Lancang and towards the lower Mekong, flooding communities up to the lower delta in Southeast Asia who are given little or no time at all to fully prepare for the sudden onslaught of water. And then, for state security purposes, Beijing considers its entire nationwide water management strategy a very closely guarded secret, including its management of the Lancang. And so, despite many efforts made by the other nations further downstream around the Mekong to work together and manage the river through organizations like the Mekong River Commission, China has thus far declined to ever join. The reality today is that the lower Mekong Basin is entering its 4th straight year of severe drought, with poorer than average rainfall, the ever-advancing threat of climate change, and a series of massive hydropower dams collectively causing all of these problems for the Asian continent's 3rd largest waterway. The livelihoods of more than 70 million people are at a serious risk of instability or even collapse. Important steps are going to need to be taken by them and China in order to preserve the river, its natural rhythm, and its natural resources.
China's water management secrecy subjects Southeast Asia to both unpredictable drought and unpredictable flooding. The nations reliant on the MeKong are in quite a bind because China is going to do exactly what it thinks it needs to do. For them, it's a matter of state secrets and national security, and China is going to continue to dam or otherwise interact with the upper reaches of the Mekong as it sees fit. The situation is not very cheery, and we generally don't hear about it too much. The Communist Party does not let this information get out. Water security in China is considered a national secret, and they act accordingly. China's situation roughly mirrors that of India. They're suffering an immense drought right now. China is in the very unfortunate situation of their water-abundant regions suffering a massive drought, while their arid regions that are dependent on water being shipped north have suffered. But on top of that, unseasonable rain comes along, similar to India, and destroys crops just as they're ready for harvest. I treat the reporting of these smaller Chinese channels with a grain of salt. They are intensely critical of the CCP, and for good reason. But the videos they collect provide a glimpse of drought or flood conditions experienced by China. When you couple this with the massive pollution that makes water unsuitable for even agriculture, and the disruption to water supplies caused by, ironically caused by all their waterworks to solve water issues, the situation there is not really good.
Among the 15 provinces in the south, 12 provinces have experienced reduced precipitation, and the 6 provinces in the Yangtze River Basin, including Sichuan, Chongqing, Hunan, Hubei, Jiangxi, and Anhui, have experienced the most significant reduction in precipitation. According to the National Climate Center Forecast Bulletin, it is predicted that the drought may continue in 2023. And most areas in the country will have higher temperatures and less precipitation in the spring. Since the beginning of this year, most parts of southwest China have experienced a 20 to 50% reduction in precipitation compared to the same period in previous years. Southern Sichuan and most parts of Yunnan have experienced a reduction of more than 80% in precipitation. As of February 28th, there was a moderately severe meteorological drought in southern Sichuan, most of Yunnan, western Guizhou, and northwest Jiangxi. However, according to official CCP propaganda, China's grain production has achieved continuous harvests in the past 19 years, and last year, despite droughts, floods, and the impact of the pandemic, the total grain output still reached a historical high. Whether this is a statistical issue or data falsification remains unknown. In addition, China's arable land is continuously decreasing. At the command of Xi Jinping, local governments began to take action, even setting various targets or providing subsidies to increase cultivated land area. The authorities also implemented the policy of returning forests to farmland, resulting in the felling of a large number of trees, and many unsuitable places for farming were forcibly developed into farmland by the government. Many videos online show that numerous locations now use the name of developing high-standard farmland to excavate mountains and even cut down forests to open up new terraced fields. However, these terraced fields are not suitable for large-scale mechanized production due to their small size. Many young people in rural areas now choose to work in the cities, and those able to farm on terraced fields are mainly the older generation of farmers. As these farmers gradually age, these terraced fields may eventually be abandoned. On March 15th, in Guizhou, in response to Xi Jinping's call for the returning of forests to farmland policy, the local government dug up the existing trees on the mountain and transformed the mountain into terraced fields to receive subsidies from the authorities. However, after obtaining the subsidies, they planted the trees again. This way, the local officials both upheld Xi Jinping's policy and received subsidies, which would be a win-win situation. In the video, farmers sarcastically commented that planting rice crops on mountains is very popular among farmers and that Yunnan has promoted 500,000 mu of land this year, with the highest yield of 788 kilograms per mu. Yet, it can be seen from the footage that the crops are mostly dead, and the rice grains produced are withered and inedible. As we know, local governments in China have always sold land to real estate developers as their main source of revenue. China's real estate development has taken place for over a decade, and a large amount of arable land has been transformed into commercial residential buildings, factories, and other infrastructure, severely eroding the amount of cultivated land. Therefore, some people suggest returning buildings to farmland, as there are more buildings on potentially arable farmland than crops.
China's immense water reclamation and redistribution projects are a tale of intentions gone wrong. From the simple objective to rewrite nature to the benefit of the country, China has only granted itself a temporary benefit at the cost of widespread productive ruin.
Chinese officials claim that the project will send the abundant water resources from the rivers in southern China to the water-starved north and northwest, thus changing the situation of frequent floods in the south and droughts and severe water shortages in the north. The project runs through 4 major river basins in China, namely the Yangtze, Huai, Yellow, and Hai rivers, and the total investment is estimated to be over $77.2 billion. Guarantee rate of domestic and industrial water supply has been raised from less than 80% to over 97% in benefited cities along the eastern route. The rate of domestic water supply in those by the middle route has been elevated from less than 75% to more than 95%, and the rate of industrial water supply has been up to over 90%. In fact, it's an illusion created by the Chinese government. Even before the project is completed, it has shown that its potential damages are even worse than those of the Three Gorges project. The Central Main Canal is over 1,000 kilometers long, like an elevated bridge. It's a hanging river in the Central Plains. In the event of a canal collapse, the consequences would be more serious than the Yellow River breaking its banks during the flood. Why then did Chinese water experts barely raise their objections? In the Three Gorges project, the experts who signed the report in agreement became academicians of the Chinese Academy of Engineering and the Academy of Sciences, while 9 of the experts who didn't sign the report didn't become academicians. Chinese scholars have learned to keep their mouths shut from their experience with the controversy of the Three Gorges project. The South to North Water Transfer Project, which is now in operation and under construction, is officially reported to have cost $77.2 billion, but the real cost will never be known. More importantly, it's not the end point for spending money. The central government has provided only less than $6.3 billion for the project. The rest, at least over $70 billion, came from bank loans and construction funds, which are supposed to be repaid by the proceeds of water sales. Bank loans are from ordinary people's savings accounts. If the water usage of the project doesn't meet projections, it means that the banks will incur many bad debts, and it becomes questionable if people can recover their deposits at the bank. So will the project break even in a reasonable period of time? Unlikely. In December 2014, China's National Development and Reform Commission announced the price of water supply for the Central Line project. It revealed the average annual net revenue from water sales was $1 billion, or 2.5% of the investment. That is, it will take about 30 to 40 years to recover the investment, but there are reasons to doubt if the project will safely survive these few decades. The project plan calls for an average of 18.5 billion cubic meters of water to be transferred each year from the east and central lines, which should total about 130 billion cubic meters over 7 years. According to recent official data, the cumulative transfer of water to the north is nearly 50 billion cubic meters. In other words, only 38% of the target has been achieved. This is based on the official data. As data falsification is serious in China, the actual percentage can be lower. So why has the project failed to achieve the expected results? According to Wang Wei Luo, a Chinese water expert living in Germany, at the beginning of the project, local governments along the route thought that the water was free to use, so they provided a high quota. As a result, the project planned the capacity to transfer 18.5 billion cubic meters of water per year. But it turned out the central government required the local areas to pay for the water. Moreover, local governments need to build facilities to connect the water to the water supply networks, so the cost to end users becomes very high. According to the Water Resources Bulletin of Shandong Province, the price of water from the south to north water transfer project is about 95 US cents per cubic meter, while the price of local surface water and groundwater is between 5 and 10 US cents per cubic meter. As a result, many local governments say that the cost of water is too high and that they don't need as much water as they did in the original plan. There is another important reason that local governments don't dare to say directly. The water from this project isn't desirable because it's very polluted and the water quality is poor. Water resources in China have been polluted extensively. In October 2016, the School of Environmental Studies at Tsinghua University in Beijing released a report on water research, which collected water samples from 44 cities in 23 provinces in China, and all of them were found to be at high risk of carcinogenic substances. In the south to north water transfer project, water quality was surprisingly poor at some key points. Because of the lack of collaboration between cities in China's corrupt and inefficient government system, the local government is only concerned with the development of the local economy, and the welfare of other cities isn't their concern. For example, the Central Line project starts at the Dianjiangkou Reservoir in Henan Province, which connects to the Han River. The upper reaches of the Han River are in Shiyan, an industrial city in Hebei Province. The Shending River, which connects to the Han River, is the discharge point for the city's sewage plant, and the black sewage is discharged almost directly into the Shending River, with little or no treatment and a pungent smell. The river is listed in the Shiyan city record as having poor Category 5 water quality. That standard doesn't even meet the standards for agricultural, irrigation, and landscape water. Local villagers say they don't even dare to touch the river water. Their feet will itch for days as long as they step into the river. Now the polluted water flows into the Han River and is delivered to Beijing. The Han River has another tributary from a county in Shanxi Province. This county has more than 300,000 people whose domestic and production sewage also enters the Han River, and the locals call this tributary a natural septic tank. The water from the septic tank also ends up in Beijing. Since the 1980s, various tanneries, paper mills, glass factories, and fertilizer plants have been built in the area, discharging large amounts of sewage directly into the river. It was reported in the media that around 2013, up to 200 people in a village of fewer than 1,000 people had cancer. The Huai River intersects with the eastern route of the south to north water transfer project, which is connected by a canal and forms part of the eastern route. As early as 2006, the Huai River Water Resources Protection Scientific Research Institute predicted that the Eastern Route project could cause rapid deterioration of water quality in the trunk line and serious water pollution incidents. As a result, many cities have tried to reduce the amount of water they receive from this major project. The city of Tianjin, next to Beijing, rejected the water from the south to north water transfer project outright, preferring to use desalinated water. The south to north water transfer project itself has also caused great damage to the natural environment. According to Wang Wei Luo, the main canal of the Central Line project has built more than 200 projects across large and medium-sized rivers, Hundreds of natural rivers have been interrupted by this main canal and have disappeared. In its natural state, before the south to north water transfer project was built, there were more than 800 natural rivers flowing from west to east. But after the south to north water transfer trunk canal was built, only 200 rivers remained. Some scholars estimate that the approximate percentage of water taken from the Han River is 36%. In his book Water, water expert Robin Clark points out that the more water is taken from the runoff, the bigger the problem it causes. According to the European experience, a ratio of less than 5% won't cause problems. A ratio of more than 20% will cause serious problems. China's Caixin.com reported in 2019 that several scholars pointed out that the water level of the Han River has dropped severely after the Central Line Transfer Project. Water pollution has increased and aquatic fish may have decreased significantly. Many more scholars believe that the transfer of water from the south to the north may lead to a greater backflow of salty tides into the Yangtze River, thus affecting the quality of Shanghai's drinking water and causing a water crisis. In February 2019, the former Vice Minister of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development of China published a signed article in a professional magazine, Water Supply and Drainage, in which he wrote, "As the scale of water diversion increases, at the same time, in some places, the difference in composition between the transferred water and the local water has led to the dissolution of scale in the tap water pipeline, resulting in new pollution, which is quite difficult to control. Therefore, the model of long-distance water transfer to solve water shortage has been in trouble to some extent." 4 months later, the official was removed from his post. How long can the troubled south-to-north water transfer project last? In 2014, an online commentary by an American physicist argued that in a few years' time, sedimentation alone would be enough to scrap the world's mega project. He wrote that the south-to-north water transfer project was a complete failure and a bad idea. In the project's demonstration and implementation, no sediment experts were involved. Because the experts knew that the sediment problem couldn't be solved, he used a video to prove his point. It's not an exaggeration to say that this project, with an investment of $77 billion is a disaster. In November 2019, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang hosted a meeting on the follow-up work of the south-to-north water transfer project. This sparked concern among analysts who asked, what follow-up work is needed for this project? The CCP finishes the main project of water transfer first, leaving many problems including pollution control for the future. Later, more and bigger projects are needed to remedy the problems. Along with this, China's economic environment is deteriorating. This project has not only left a huge debt burden, but will also require a lot of money to maintain and repair in the future. Some may argue that if the water shortage in the northern cities is remedied by this project, then to a certain extent, it's also meaningful. Let's consider a simple example. The biggest drive to launch this project was because the CCP claimed that Beijing was experiencing water shortages. Currently, 1 billion cubic meters of water is transferred from the south to Beijing every year. There are 5 major rivers flowing through Beijing, among which the Yangtze River was the largest source of water for Beijing. After the CCP established its regime in 1949, more than 500 reservoirs were built on the Yangtze River, causing it to be 90% depleted and eventually declared unfit for drinking. Some scholars believe that if the Yangtze River was revitalized to its natural ecology and flow, and water pollution in the basin was treated, Beijing wouldn't be short of 1 billion or 1.5 billion cubic meters of water.
The reporting on the problems and shortfalls of China's major water projects are repeated in other sources as well, and the overall picture that is painted is of a national collapse in their water systems that are undermining their food production, manufacturing, and ultimately their ability to export. My sense is this is a major unspoken motivation to decouple from China. It is also an unspoken motivation for China's belligerence.
The CCP has no respect or conservation for nature. Slogans such as "Let the mountains bow, let the rivers yield," and "Dare to change the sun and moon into a new sky" were popular slogans in China in the 1950s and 1960s. Although in recent years, the CCP has transformed its warlike slogans into seemingly humanistic and poetic language, the underlying belief that mankind will prevail over nature and destiny has never changed.
I want to point out here that the headlong rush for profit and productivity by the CCP is at least as lethal as is its ideological antithesis, own pursuit of the same goals. As extremes of weather mount, from drought to unpredictable epic flooding in the headwaters for China, India, and the rest of Asia's rivers wither away in Tibet, these major water projects are even more unfit for purpose and are even lethally destructive. In the face of greater climatic uncertainty, decoupling from the dependencies of the global market are objectively reasonable. Whether they are optimal is likely irrelevant and also unknowable. Too much is subject to change, and the economic imperatives of multinationals and the ideological preoccupations of policymakers are destructive, if not dysfunctional.
Push to grow more rice is running up against a major hurdle: the lack of water. In the 1960s, India embarked on a green revolution, introducing high-yield rice and wheat varieties to address food shortages. West Bengal, Uttar Pradesh, and Punjab became important rice-growing areas. But rice is a notoriously thirsty crop, using around 2,300 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of rice. When the rains did not come, Indian farmers started pumping groundwater to irrigate their paddy fields.
About 2/3 of the states in India are actually facing groundwater depletion. And it is serious. And it's not something that happened overnight. I think it has happened over time, over several years. And it is because of increasing use of groundwater for irrigation. 90% of the groundwater use in India today is for irrigation. Very intensifying systems in some parts, but also that coupled with a number of policies like cheap electricity, huge subsidies for irrigation pumps. So all that has sort of, incentivized the farmers to actually extract more and more groundwater.
In this country, we need to do whatever we can do to save water, to conserve water. And the cropping pattern that we have today is just completely the opposite. And you see that there is water distress, there is farmers' distress, and there is farmer suicide. Therefore, as a result in Vidarbha, because it's just not sustainable.
While high-yield rice led to a dramatic increase in output, there are now questions over its sustainability.
So the green revolution paradigm that is very production-centric has been carried forward until today. It started in the 1960s, and it has saved countries like India and Indonesia from rice shortages, from starvation during periods of wars, political instabilities, and droughts. But then this paradigm is no longer sustainable and is already outdated because green revolution paradigm introduced intensive agriculture practices and use a lot of inputs from high-yielding seeds, water, pesticides, fertilizers. And this has created crisis on our environment and in our ecosystem.
What the Green Revolution succeeded at is boosting India's rice output, turning it into the world's largest exporter. The South Asian country accounts for about 40% of global rice shipments.
The reality is the agricultural revolution and other water use has pulled apart the natural abundance we had utilized before, and all of that has pushed up water demand beyond what we can reliably draw upon. And all this is going on while climate change is altering everything, everywhere.
The world's fourth largest producer and consumer of rice. Without fertilizers to boost output, the country will have difficulty meeting domestic demand, a roadblock in Indonesia's push for self-sustainability.
Kalau kita melihat, kita kan kalau bicara pupuk juga banyak kita masih impor. Artinya Bapak Presiden mengingatkan kepada seluruh aparatnya, mengingat perang Rusia dan Ukraina ini masih berlangsung. Kemudian sumber pupuk juga berasal dari kedua negara tersebut. Nah, ini harus menjadi kewaspadaan kita. Nah, kemudian di mana pupuk ini juga sangat fundamental kan dalam rangka meningkatkan produktivitas pertanian. Secara prinsip ini dulu kita pegang bahwa makanan pokok bangsa kita adalah beras. Itu kita pegang dulu. Artinya kita harus berusaha memenuhi kebutuhan mereka dulu. Kebutuhan sebagaimana yang saya bilang tadi untuk menjamin atau mendukung ketahanan pangan.
But with the population growing, boosting rice output remains one of the government's top priorities. In 2020, Indonesia launched a program to grow rice, corn, and other crops to reduce reliance on food imports. The new food estate project covers an area of 770,000 hectares, more than 10 times the size of Singapore, in Kalimantan, Sumatra, and Papua. But Indonesia has attempted this before. More than 2 decades earlier, a project to turn more than 1.4 million hectares in Kalimantan into rice plantations ended in failure.
I think in my view, on average, Indonesian farmers not still ready to face climate change. There's still a need to invest more in more affordable, more accessible, climate-resilient technologies such as, low carbon rice cultivation. There's a need for better infrastructure to inform farmers about climate. So the methodology, climatologies, and geophysical body BMKG in Indonesia could perhaps improve the way they share information to farmers.
Tapi pada satu hal, kita akan berusaha menggunakan pupuk-pupuk organik, menghindari ketergantungan itulah itu menjadi penting. Maka ini pertanian persawahan ini harus terintegrasi ke peternakan, karena jerami bisa jadi pakan ternak, pakan sapi, gitu kan. Nah, ini yang sedang kami lakukan hari-hari ke depan, dan saya intens berkomunikasi dengan teman-teman peternak, dengan lembaga-lembaga peternak, asosiasi peternak. Nah, itu akan kita supaya masyarakat memelihara sapi. Nanti kotoran sapi itu dikonversi ke sawah melalui proses tertentu ya. Jerami difermentasi, kotoran sapi difermentasi, gitu kan.
National level officials address their nation's problems as best they can, and it definitely has its place. But it is also instructive to see what rural people do to adapt to change. These are not passive victims of their circumstance, and their solutions can be surprising for those of us who are so dependent and indeed fetishize high tech. Developed nations think in terms of global trade and large-scale mechanized farming. For rural populations, none of this may be relevant to their basic survival.
Even in the most isolated parts of Bangladesh, communities have devised ways to stay ahead of potential weather disasters like floods and cyclones. And they're discovering new ways to use the natural resources around them to build resilience. NPR reporter Lauren Freyer just returned from Bangladesh and joins me now. Lauren, thank you so much. First, what are the factors that make Bangladesh particularly vulnerable to climate change?
So it's really the geography. I mean, Bangladesh is a low-lying country. Essentially, the whole country, or almost the whole country, is a river delta just south of the Himalayan mountains. These are tiny, muddy, narrow, shallow rivers in the dry season, but in the wet season, they just become like a shallow sea. And so people are dividing their livelihoods between agriculture in the dry season and then adapting to basically living on water in the wet season, so adapting to fishing and kind of trying to keep their agriculture alive through raised gardens. I did some interviews with some villagers where instead of growing squash and vines on the ground, they've raised them like 8 levels high. So they live under a canopy of shade provided by their vegetables, but also those vegetables survive when the area floods.
The methods that you just laid out, those were adaptations, right? Those were methods that they've employed in order to adapt to changing weather patterns.
Yeah, so I mean, these are indigenous community solutions. I mean, Bangladesh does have some high-tech solutions. So they have one of the most advanced flood warning systems in the world. They're using satellite technology to track cyclones. They have buoys that are measuring water levels using solar-powered buoys. But what scientists have been telling me that even more important than the high-tech solutions in Bangladesh is what they call social capital. So for example, I went out to a village that's 2 hours boat ride from the nearest road. And even they, without phones, without radio, without television, were able to get these flood warnings through this sort of human chain of communication. And in this village, which saw some of the worst flooding in 2022 that Bangladesh had ever seen, every single person in the village survived. So the human chain of communication really worked for them. In the village that I went to, there were people without even phones, but at least one relative, or in this case, a neighbor's relative, had a phone, got that audio recording, and then passed the word by word of mouth. So it's those kind of like very small, practical solutions that villagers are creating on their own to help them survive and adapt to, the changing climate. One of the top climate scientists in Bangladesh told me, hey, if the US has any climate skeptics, send them over here. It will cure them of that. Because I found, and he's found, like 100% awareness of climate change because people have experienced it in their own lives. And one of the things that Bangladesh does better than any other country is this communication, this human chain of people-to-people communication. So that it's not just high-tech solutions, it's low-tech community-based solutions.
By tapping the immense variety of rice, farmers can tailor their crops to the changing environment. In Indonesia, one company, Javara, is doing exactly this. Founder Helianti Hilman works with thousands of farmers across Indonesia to reintroduce legacy rice varieties.
The last I have records, about 4 years ago, we still have about 1,200 varieties. But normally it's like within like small groups. And sometimes they even growing it in pots, like the urban farming, in containers, just for the sake of keeping alive the seeds, because they believe that probably one day, if there is floods, they will need rice that are resilient towards, water, or if there is drought, they need rice that, resilience towards the drought. So basically, it's really about making sure that our variety are still kept alive so that whenever we need it, then we have it available. Or even in the coastal area, unfortunately during the tsunami in Aceh, it was like swept away. But we used to have rice that can grow on the sandy beach and taking, high salinity.
While diversity in rice strains is important, there are calls now to diversify across the food supply chain as well. For Asia, this means reducing our dependence on rice as a staple.
Maka Badan Pangan pun sudah gencar menyampaikan bagaimana kita harus mendukung pemanfaatan pangan lokal.
We need to diversify first is accordingly to the environment, to the ecological. If you are in a arid land area like the eastern part of Indonesia, like Sumba and things like that, then most natural you will go with sorghum or with corn, because this is something that they can grow easily, even during a very harsh, dry condition.
Even Thailand, the rice bowl of Asia, is looking into alternatives.
แล้วก็ทำน้อยได้มากเนี่ยระบบแบบนี้มันเริ่มเข้ามาแล้วสำหรับประเทศไทยนะคะแล้วก็ปรับเปลี่ยนโดยการที่ว่าจากการทำนา3ครั้งก็เหลือ2ครั้งก็เอาไปปลูกพืชตัวอื่นหรือทำนา2ครั้งเนี่ยเดี๋ยวนี้คนก็เปลี่ยนมาเป็นทำนาครั้งเดียวแล้วก็ไปปลูกพืชอย่างอื่น คือถั่วเขียวประเทศไทยเรายังขาดแคลนอยู่นะคะแล้วก็ยังนำเข้าอยู่
Addressing unpredictable yields and rising input costs will be crucial. Otherwise, we could lose one key cogwheel of our rice supply chain: the farmers themselves.
Ya soalnya kan kalau petani kan isu-isu pagi-pagi berangkat, udah itu ya belok apa kan kotor kan. Kalau zaman sekarang mah kan nggak mau gitu. Anak saya mah nggak ada yang jadi petani.
Global average age of farmers is around 60 years old. So if the agriculture sector's profit is going down, is becoming less and less profitable, then less and less younger generation would like to go into the agriculture sector.
Indonesia are losing 500,000 farmers every year. 30, 40 years down the road, I don't know whether the food sovereignty is there. Because food security, if you rely only for imports, what happens if there is a global catastrophe? When the countries decided to keep their own inventory of the staple food for their own food security, then we will be in problem.
The scenario for Asia's rural farmer base, and by extension for Asia's economies and for global trade, is a daunting one. As is the case for agriculture everywhere, Asia's farmers are aging out, while their livelihood itself is increasingly precarious and unprofitable. A few bad seasons may cause a nation's farming production to unravel dramatically, while for now, they are all doing so slowly. Unless some other source of food rises, many nations might simply fade from the global economy.